Hello everyone, my name is Ashley, and today I'm going to tell you a bit about mindfulness in classical music pedagogy. I'm an appraiser of Asian art, but I previously studied musicology at university, and I'm a lifelong violinist, so I'm particularly interested in this topic. While this presentation isn't directly about Asian art, it discusses elements of Buddhist meditation, which inspired much of the antique art I now work with in my appraisal business. I hope you enjoy it, and that it invites some food for thought, as this is a severely under-researched area of study. At first glance, mindfulness and classical music pedagogy appear to be two very different topics. However, mindfulness and Buddhist meditation have influenced classical music pedagogy since at least the mid-20th century. As a result, mindfulness and classical music share significant overlap in their teaching methods. Today, the broad topic of mindfulness is widely covered both in popular culture and in academia, especially with regards to education. However, the relationship between mindfulness and classical music practice methods continues to receive far less attention, as there remains very little academic interest about how mindfulness can better facilitate long-term musical goals. In this presentation, I will examine the relationship between mindfulness and classical music pedagogy, both in Japan and in the United States. To do this, I will examine two case studies. The first is the Suzuki Violin method by Japanese teacher Shinichi Suzuki. This protocol, what she coined talent education, integrated elements of Zen Buddhism and would revolutionize elementary classical music pedagogy in post-war America. The second case study is much more contemporary, a currently ongoing series of mindfulness seminars given by San Francisco Symphony cellist Barbara Bogatin, delivered at Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Northern California. Through examining these two studies, I will demonstrate how Suzuki and Bogatin have introduced mindfulness practices into classical music pedagogy, and determine whether certain elements are instead intrinsic to classical music practice methods and have indeed been there all along. To begin, it's worth briefly outlining the benefits of mindfulness in education. Mindfulness is one of the four pillars of Vipassana and originally took inspiration from Buddhist meditation practices, despite having no official religious affiliation. Mindful Nation UK has defined mindfulness as paying attention to what's happening in the present moment in the mind, body, and external environment with an attitude of curiosity and kindness. Mindfulness practitioners are allowed to maintain their lifestyles and are not asked to make new commitments outside of their meditation centers. Mindfulness has been shown to assist with the alleviation of stress, character building, concentration, cognitive flexibility, and metacognition, which is considered a critical element of learning. As a result, there's been a substantial interest in integrating mindfulness techniques into educational settings over the past 2 decades. American psychologist Daniel Goleman indicates that these skills can predict academic attainment and eventually socioeconomic factors in adulthood, although monetary gain is beyond the scope of this presentation. To provide some introductory context for the case studies, I will first briefly mention typical practice methods for classical musicians in America, which are very similar to those in most Western countries. In order to advance to a high level, especially a professional level, musicians require rigorous individual instruction spanning decades, usually beginning at a very young age. It's not uncommon for professional classical musicians to begin learning their instruments, or at the very least, learning how to read music, alongside beginning preschool and learning how to read regular books. In classical music practice, the relationship between the teacher and the student is an integral part of the musician's success. When the music student is young, they may have several teachers, but as they become older and their craft becomes more serious, they usually develop a relationship with one teacher for their primary instruction, sometimes studying with the same person for decades. These circumstances primarily apply to students on the path to becoming a professional musician, but most amateur musicians also have prolonged periods of study with a single teacher, either through individual study or in ensemble settings with other musicians. In each case study, I will delve further into these practices and explain their relationship with mindfulness. The first case study examines Japanese music pedagogue Shinichi Suzuki and the popular instructional method, the Suzuki Violin method,
or sometimes called talent education. Briefly, I will outline the personal history of his upbringing in Japan, which served as the backbone of his pedagogical philosophy. Suzuki, who was perhaps the most famous and influential pedagogue in classical music history, came from a family of classical musicians. His father was a string maker who ran a violin factory. Shinichi was therefore exposed to music from a very young age and was captivated by the idea of mass reproduction, which would later become an integral element of his teaching method. Perhaps the most important aspect of Suzuki's upbringing, though, is that he came from a family of devout Zen Buddhists and was an avid practitioner himself of Zen meditation and student of Buddhist ethics. After World War II ended, Japan experienced an outburst of interest in Western classical music, creating a larger pool than ever of new students who needed to learn to play an instrument from scratch. Therefore, Suzuki decided to develop a learning method that catered to children, younger than ever before, sometimes even beginning at 2 or 3 years old. Suzuki's method was revolutionary, not only for its contents, but also because it was the first popular method, or maybe even method at all, whose primary aim was not to produce successful musicians, but instead to create better human beings. To achieve this, he borrowed elements of Zen Buddhist meditation practices and transformed them into musical exercises. Suzuki once described his own motivations for the method. He said, "I just want to make good citizens. If a child hears good music from the day of his birth and learns to play it himself, he develops sensitivity, discipline, and endurance. He gets a beautiful heart. If nations cooperate in raising good children, perhaps there won't be any war." Suzuki's goals rest on 2 main assumptions. The first is that learning music can sensitize the individual, and the second is that these improvements are enough to heal the fabric of society. As his words make evident, Suzuki believed that the ultimate goal of his method was not to produce professional musicians, but rather to use music pedagogy as a tool to facilitate the improvement of society. However, mindfulness similarly makes uses of intrinsically simple practices, such as silence, focusing on a single object, or repetition in order to achieve a wide array of benefits for health and well-being. In this context, was Suzuki's vision truly so far-fetched, even if unheard of at the time?
To determine this, let us now examine the Suzuki method itself. Suzuki did not believe that any music student possessed innate talent, but that talent, just like any other educational skill, could be taught. His method likens learning music to language acquisition, in that students learn best from a young age while the brain is still developing, and that they benefit from constant oral exposure to the desired topic, not just through practicing, but also by actively listening to the sounds that come from the mother. He centered his method around this idea, which he called the mother tongue technique, since it was assumed at the time that mothers provided the overwhelming majority of caregiving. In the early years of violin learning, full responsibility fell on the student's mother to ensure the child's progress. The violin books were supplemented by audio guides that played the pieces that the student was learning at the time. It was the mother's role to oversaturate the child's environment with this music, playing the recordings whenever possible, humming the tunes herself, and even learning to play the violin alongside the student in the early stages. The mother was meant to attend all lessons with the teacher, and take over at home in between lessons, supervising all practice time. As for the actual technique of talent education, Suzuki's method revolved around tonalizations, a term for short musical fragments of a few bars at most that targeted specific hurdles for the student to overcome. Suzuki's tonalizations could last up to a few seconds but were often shorter. The purpose of these tonalizations was not only to improve the student's ability to play a specific piece, but also to mold their overall technique, which would apply to any piece that they played. Above all, though, Suzuki believed that through sheer repetition of his tonalizations, he could shape his students into gentler, happier, and more selfless human beings, and that intensive repetition was strong enough to erode the ego. To get a sense of perspective of the scale that he had in mind, in 1957, he once repeated a single note 100,000 times. The feat took him 25 days. Once students had learned a piece of music, The Suzuki method instructed them to repeatedly play alongside the provided recordings. Suzuki commented, "The student's music becomes one with the record, and his sensitivity grows before he knows it." In Becoming One with the Record, Suzuki trained students to hyper-focus not on their own interpretations, which they're not advanced yet to have developed, but instead on fully adhering to the styles and techniques of the recording, following the concept of knowing the musical rules before you break them. On a broader scale, though, Suzuki may have seen this exercise as a way to train students to consider perspectives aside from their own, thus only growing their sensitivity. Once students had ample practice playing alongside the recordings, they often played together in groups with their teachers and peers, either in their violin studios or at specialized Suzuki training camps in groups up to 500. Even more effective than the recordings, the purpose of this exercise was to tame their egos through collaborating for a common cause. Suzuki made clear that his musical path was not intended as a roadmap to becoming a professional musician, but instead a guide to ensure that children develop into ethical human beings.
When Suzuki arrived in America for his first talent education tour in 1964, the reception was mixed. Audiences were initially awestruck by Suzuki's ability to teach children as young as 2 years old. The Suzuki method was, however, introduced to America amidst continued distrust for Japan, anxiety over impending involvement in the Vietnam War, and the struggles of the civil rights movement. American critics were quick to dismiss the method altogether. Time magazine wrote a headline about Suzuki called "Invasion from the Orient." Look magazine soon followed up with an article asking if methods so gracefully Oriental could survive the chrome distractions of American life. Even parents who embraced the Suzuki method often appeared to misunderstand it. They would skip over the listening components, which they found boring or too slow, and prioritize the child's interest in the material over how the method could benefit the child in the long run. To these complaints, Suzuki responded, "Where are you hurrying to?" Parents would also skip the child's lessons or wouldn't supervise them at home. Without this collaborative element, children often struggled to remain engaged. Parents' biggest struggle, though, was refraining from nurturing their child's ego-based qualities, such as creativity, inspiration, and individuality, believing that these characteristics enhanced playing instead of detracting from it. The individualist nature of American society at the time made Suzuki's idea of suppressing the ego unfathomable to the average American parent. The Suzuki method was revolutionary for its time, especially in America, and paved the way for later classical musicians to further develop mindful practice methodologies. One such musician is Barbara Bogatin, a cellist with the San Francisco Symphony. Bogatin is a longtime member of the nearby Spirit Rock Meditation Center, and joined after her husband Clifford Cerrone, a neuroscientist, introduced her to a Vipassana retreat with Jack Kornfield in the 1980s. Together with Spirit Rock teacher Sylvia Borstein, they have developed a series of seminars on mindful practice techniques that they deliver at neuroscience conferences or mindfulness retreats, such as at Spirit Rock. Her most popular seminar is called The Buddha, the Brain, and Bach, which outlines how musicians can utilize mindfulness techniques to improve their playing, while making the process emotionally healthier, more sustainable long-term, and ultimately more enjoyable. As with Suzuki's method, no religious affiliation is necessary to participate. Bogatin claims that sheer repetition, especially if done mindlessly, is insufficient to create professional classical musicians. Instead, consistent and conscious practice is key to reach any improvement. She stresses 2 points above all: to practice with intention and to be critical of the sound, not the self. Like with Suzuki's method, when a student makes a mistake, they should not be upset with themselves or overanalyze their self-worth as an artist, but instead, they should focus on correcting the music. Additionally, students should make mental notes of when they play well, not just when they've made mistakes, as the human brain has evolved to pay more attention to the mistakes, requiring a conscious effort to reverse this pattern. To achieve these goals, Bogatin borrows directly from mindfulness and Vipassana techniques that she learned at Spirit Rock, including awareness of feeling of the seated body, following the flow of your breath, moving your attention to energy in different areas of the body, and listening to the surrounding sounds. These techniques are integrated into Bogatin's 4 essential steps of practice, which the student follows when addressing any difficult musical passage. The first is observation. The student asks, "How am I using my body and this instrument?" The second is analysis of the technical issue. This comprises identifying the problem, determining the necessary change, and making the change. The third step, while seemingly simple, can often be the hardest: repetition. This step is crucial to ensuring that the positive change is cemented. Lastly, the student must re-observe in order to solve any other lingering problems. Bogatin also stresses the importance of the relationship between the student and the teacher. As a teacher herself, she tailors technical methods to the needs of the student, instead of insisting that students do things her way. This method differs fundamentally from that of Suzuki, who would try to distance the student from a sense of self, rather than nurture it. Tens of thousands of hours are required to cement any musical skill. Studies have shown that this exhaustive level of repetition can cause neuroplasticity, among other general benefits of mindfulness in education. Barbara claims that practicing mindfully can help prevent injuries from overpracticing, which is a very common problem for professional musicians. Lastly, in the spirit of practicing non-judgmentally, Bogatin reminds her audiences, every practice session is a fresh start, advice that is meant to help students remain in the moment. Unlike the Suzuki method, which is a world-famous technique with ample literature, Bogatin's method is currently less known, to date primarily reaching audiences at Spirit Rock and online. However, if further published and spread, her methodology shows great potential to reform classical music practice techniques in adults, as it fills a gap in the currently available literature. The Suzuki method provides a foundation for children to practice mindfully, which is important, but once students become adults, they can no longer avoid facing musical issues that involve the ego, such as creativity, interpretation, and individuality. As Bogatin does not teach Buddhism, she does not advocate for ego suppression, but encourages similar tonalizations that isolate technical issues without judgment. Bogatin's methods can serve as a tool to help navigate potentially difficult musical topics mindfully, efficiently, and, as Suzuki would have approved of, kindly.
While there has recently been substantial academic interest in mindfulness, a gap remains in the field of mindfulness and music pedagogical practices. Currently, the only published research is on the Suzuki method. Suzuki paved the way for mindfulness practices in the American music classroom with his talent education method, integrating his own Zen Buddhist practices. Given the inherently focused and repetitive nature of classical music practice, the kind necessary to become a professional musician, many elements of mindfulness are intrinsic to effective music practice, and therefore are already intuitive to classical musicians. This, however, is where Bogatin's method is particularly effective. Bogatin helps musicians of all levels isolate the elements of mindfulness that they already know from being musicians, because repetitive practice, which is necessary for all musical improvement, is much more effective when executed consciously and with hyperfocus, or, in other words, mindfully. Suzuki's method is better suited to children who practice fragmented elements of mindfulness without knowing it, in a presentation that's catered to their needs and early stage of development. Suzuki's method also shies away from the self, reflecting his Buddhist upbringing, whereas Bogatin's embraces it while avoiding religion altogether. Each method has its place in the life cycle of the serious classical musician, and likely also in that of amateurs. Suzuki brought elements of mindfulness practice techniques to America, some of which have likely been integrated into classical music practice methods all along. Methods such as Bogatin's enable mindfulness to continue playing a role in many music students' lives today.
Here's some further reading and listening if you're interested. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, if you have any suggestions for future topics, please let me know in the comments.
Thank you for listening.